Hello everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Emerging Water Quality Issues. Are you ready to monitor PFAS in your water? I'm Laura Bush, the Editorial Director of LCGC, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're pleased to bring you this webcast presented by LCGC and sponsored by Shimadzu. Shimadzu Corporation provides cutting-edge analytical technologies that are contributing to research, technology development, and quality control in a wide variety of fields. The company responds proactively to industry trends and works closely with customers to provide solutions for various challenges. This is made possible with Shimadzu's R&D efforts to improve the performance of mass spectrometry technology, including detection and identification of trace-level pollutants. Before we get started today, we have a few housekeeping announcements. First, the webcast is designed to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions. You can submit questions at any time by typing them in the Q&A box, which you can find on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of your window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the webcast. And if you have any technical problems viewing or hearing the presentation today, please click on the question mark Help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to participate in two brief polling questions. Please click directly on your screen to enter your answers. So here's the first question. What is your current engagement with PFAS monitoring? None, just interested in the topic. Planning on implementing it in my own organization in the near future. Actively engaged with it in my organization. Or using information generated from a different laboratory to help my organization. So once again, you can click directly on your screen to enter your answers. And that question, again, is, what is your current engagement with PFAS monitoring? None, just interested in the topic. Planning on implementing it in my organization in the near future. Actively engaged with it in my organization. Using information generated from a different laboratory to help my organization. Excellent. Thank you very much for taking that first polling question. It's now time for our second polling question. And again, please click directly on the screen to enter your answers. So here's the second polling question. What is your biggest challenge for implementing or continuing PFAS analysis in your laboratory? Sample collection, sample preparation, chromatographic separation, quantitation, such as method detection limits, qualitative analysis, such as discovery of new PFAS compounds, or does not apply? So once again, that question is, what is your biggest challenge for implementing or continuing PFAS analysis in your laboratory? Sample collection, sample preparation, chromatographic separation, quantitation, such as method detection limits, qualitative analysis, such as discovery of new PFAS compounds, or does not apply? Very good. Thank you all very much for taking that second polling question. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ruth Marfil-Vega. Dr. Ruth Marfil-Vega recently joined Shimadzu as the Environmental Marketing Manager. Previously, she led and managed research teams in the water utilities industry, government agencies, and academia. Her work has focused on solving water quality issues related to emerging contaminants, such as PFAS. Dr. Marfil-Vega, thank you very much for joining us today. Please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Today, I'm going to be talking about the hottest topic in the United States related to the environmental field, and I believe it's also one of the hottest topics in other countries. In today's presentation, I'm going to be speaking about the monitoring of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in water, also known as PFAS. I've been involved in this field for over 10 years. I was doing research related to PFAS in water with different organizations and different groups. But the attention from the general public has increased dramatically since 2017. And this has caused a shift in the interest from different stakeholders in the analysis of PFAS. The increased interest and concern from citizens and general public has caused the different stakeholders, like the Environmental Protection Agency, small laboratories, small water utilities that were not involved in the analysis of PFAS, are now looking for solutions and help that can be applied to the analysis of these compounds. EPA has been involved from before in the research about PFAS. However, in the past months, the work that they've been conducting has speeded up quite a bit in order to support those new stakeholders that they are playing now in the analysis of these compounds. Because there are numerous stakeholders and different organizations that are more and more interested in the analysis of these chemicals, in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on providing some general and basic information. This is the type of information that people are looking for in order to implement actionable workflows that can help them in analyzing PFAS in water as well as other environmental matrices. For those of you listening to the webinar that have been involved in PFAS research or are more familiar with the topic, the information that I'm going to be presenting today is going to be very useful for you because this way you can understand some of the challenges and some of the solutions that are needed for those laboratories that are less familiar and, as I said earlier, they want to be proactive and start monitoring PFAS in the environment. In the presentation, I'm going to be covering the following topics. I'm going to provide just a quick introduction of Shimadzu Corporation. I'm going to talk about general information related to PFAS. Then I'll move to presenting some standard analytical methods that are published in the U.S. I'll close with some applications work, focus on the instrumental analysis due to the time constraints for this webinar. And I'll wrap up finally with some of your questions. The brief introduction about Shimadzu is that for us who are in the environmental and analytical chemistry field, when we think about Shimadzu, what comes to our mind are the analytical instruments. However, Shimadzu subsidiaries, like Shimadzu Scientific Instruments, that is the subsidiary in the U.S., have other divisions that are interrelated, help us in the analytical field. One of these divisions is the medical systems, and some of the products that are manufactured are shown in the slide. Another division, and I found this very interesting, is the aviation or the aircraft equipment division. The reason why I found very interested that Shimadzu has this business is that some of the technology that has been developed for aviation is actually applied in the mass spectrometers that the Shimadzu manufactures. Last example is an outcome from the industry and other product line. There is a high-speed video camera that can take up to 10 million frames per second. And I was a few weeks ago at the University of Texas in Arlington, and I was able to see how this camera is employed to monitor and study explosions. So it's very cool to see the results from the super fast camera. So the first question that we should answer in today's presentation is, what are PFAS? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are man-made chemicals that we all like, or at some point of our lives we all enjoy. They have really good properties for repelling water, repelling stains, and those are very beneficial properties. But those same physicochemical properties cause them to be persistent in the environment. We also love to use them in the lab. I was working on analyzing emerging contaminants, hormones, other trace organics, so Teflon and related materials were kind of my best friend. In order to don't lose the traces of these other contaminants, I had to prepare my samples using Teflon. However, when I switched to working on PFAS, my workflow had to change completely because I was getting a lot of background contamination from all these lab materials. On this left side of the slide, I have a figure that I really like. This was created by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and it highlights the complexity of the PFAS family. Each of the branches in the tree represent different types of PFAS. And as you may notice, there is a box, PFCs, that has fallen from the tree. PFCs was the first acronym that was used to refer to perfluorinated chemicals, and these are a subgroup of the PFAS class. PFCs also refers to the perfluorocarbons, the greenhouse gases, and to be able to distinguish between perfluorocarbons and perfluorinated chemicals, the use of PFCs has been discontinued under the PFAS topic, and we should use the PFAS acronym. The communication experts suggest not to do this, not to change the name for a class of contaminants, because the general public might think that us scientists are making up new compounds and new problems. But in this case, this is very important. As I said, we need to differentiate between the per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances that have specific uses and a specific origin from the PFCs, the perfluorocarbons, that are related to the refrigerants. Probably the second most important question related to the PFAS topic is if there are only PFOA and PFOS. The short answer is no. PFOA and PFOS are the most commonly known PFAS by the general public, citizens in general, and that's because we in the scientific community focus on those for longer time as they are the most prevalent and they were manufactured at higher volumes. I'm not going to go through the details and discussing all the different classes of PFAS, but the image shown in the slide gives you an idea of the complexity of this chemical class. And things are changing rapidly. The environmental scientists, we are not able to keep up with these changes in the manufacturing of PFAS. As I mentioned earlier, PFOA and PFOS were manufactured at the highest quantities for a long time. However, in early 2000s, the manufacturing practice started changing. There was, due to the concern of the impact of these chemicals on the environment and human health, different manufacturers started the effort to replace some of these most known PFAS, especially the long-chain one, those that are equal or have more than 8 carbons, like PFOA and PFOS. Some of the new chemistries include shorter chain analogs, homologs, and different functional groups are being introduced in the molecules. As I said, due to the concerns and certain regulatory or advisable approaches from in Europe and the United States, those were the causes for changing the manufacturing practices. And still, because of the increased concern by the public, we are experiencing an even faster change in how not only the manufacturers, but the main industries using PFAS are applying these compounds. I was talking to a colleague a few days ago at the American Chemical Society meeting, and he was mentioning that he's doing research in Europe related to PFAS. And he's been looking at what's happening in the paper industry in Europe, and the manufacturers are more reluctant to share information because of the questions they are receiving from multiple stakeholders and the public, and they are being more cautious about explaining which PFAS they use and how they apply those. GenX and PFBS have been the replacement chemicals that were introduced in the U.S. market in response to the phase-out of PFOA and PFOS. This was a voluntary program in which all the major manufacturers in the U.S. decided to stop the production of PFOS in the U.S. as well as importing the raw material. However, these manufacturers or others are still importing polymers that may contain PFOA and PFOS as residues. And they've also created new products to be able to maintain their position in the market and continue producing the consumer products that most of us enjoy at some point. So GenX is one of those replacement compounds that has become the most famous one in the United States. Sun and her collaborators published in Environmental Science and Technology Letters a paper in 2016 that they quantify GenX in the tap water from a utility in North Carolina. Almost a year later, after the publication of the occurrence of GenX in the scientific paper, this news reached the general public. A general news outlet published the detection of GenX in the tap water. This caused an enormous increase of questions and concerns from the communities that were impacted or were receiving that tap water. This actually happened while one of the biggest conference for water utilities was taking place in Philadelphia. And the amount of phone calls that the water quality supervisors and superintendents from these utilities received those days was amazing. You could see people at the conference just focusing on their phones and emails, trying to respond to something that had never happened before. And it was caused because of the use of social media. We've run into episodes in which some contaminants became very popular, but it was always a slow spread of the news. In this case, it was, a new situation for everybody in the environmental science and water quality community because the news broke really fast and the request started flooding everybody very quickly. When the presence of GenX in the environment got to the general public, the state of the Department of Health and Human Services in North Carolina approached Chemours, the manufacturer, and the company announced that at the end of June 2017, they would stop discharging GenX. The graph that is shown on the top right corner of the slide represents the concentrations that were monitored in the river that was receiving the discharge during the period that this episode happened. A few weeks later, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services established a health goal of 140 ppt of GenX in the receiving water. So the red line in the plot represents that 140 ppt. Almost a year later, EPA published a draft toxicity assessment for GenX as well as PFAS. As I mentioned earlier, is the other replacement compound that was introduced in the U.S. market by a different manufacturer. At the bottom of the slide, the chronic reference doses for the PFAS, GenX, as well as PFOA and PFOS are shown. While PFAS has a higher chronic reference dose than PFOA and PFOS, the GenX is only slightly higher than those for the traditional legacy PFAS. Currently, there is no assessment of the occurrence of GenX across the United States, and I'm not aware of similar studies in other countries. But there are some studies ongoing. Different agencies have funded work to complete this assessment, but we won't have results for at least a couple of other years. So what's been done so far to monitor PFAS in drinking water in the U.S.? For those of you listening that are not based in the United States or are less familiar with the regulation in the United States, the EPA has a program called the Unregulated Chemical Monitoring Rule. The third version of that, or the third round of that program was completed in 2015. And EPA published a method, EPA Method 537, that was required for the monitoring of the 6 PFAS in this UCMR campaign. The majority of utilities are required to participate in the UCMR. And then the maps that are shown on the left side of the slide represents the outcomes. And I'll dig a little bit more into these results in a second. In this UCMR 3 campaign, as I said, only 6 PFAS were monitored. The 6 PFAS selected are those that are shown in the box. And also I have listed there the method reporting limits that are in the high or close to 100 nanogram per liter level in some cases. In the red box, I'm highlighting the reporting limits for PFOA and PFOS. And the reason why I have those highlighted is because after the completion of UCMR, EPA released a health advisory. A health advisory is a level or a limit that is proposed by EPA as a recommendation, but the utilities are not don't need to meet it. The health advisory that was released by EPA is 70 nanograms per liter of PFOA and PFOS combined. So if you look at the table, you see that the method reporting limit is 40 for PFOA and 20 for PFOA. 40 plus 20 is 60. If you are running a method to analyze these compounds at these levels in the low nanograms per liter, you know that you're going to have a variability associated. So this 60 reporting limit for both compounds combined is really close to the 70 nanograms per liter from the health advisory. It's very challenging for laboratories to really assess and determine when a utility might be above, or the tap water from a given utility is above the health advisory limit. Going back to the maps, showing the results for PFOA and PFOS, the main outcome is that the contamination with PFOA and PFOS was very localized. You can see in the maps with the colors the areas that were hotspots for these contaminants. However, it's important to highlight that these results were generated with those method reporting limits, 40 nanograms per liter for PFOS and 20 for PFOA. So we know that these compounds are present at much lower concentrations, and as I'll be touching on in a few slides, majority of people are looking at much lower levels than these 40 and 20 nanograms per liter. So if we start monitoring and analyzing compounds with lower reporting limits, the picture shown by these maps might change completely. As I said, EPA completed the UCMR in 2015, released the health advisory in 2016, and this year, in February, EPA made a big announcement. The EPA announced that they are starting the most comprehensive cross-agency plan to address a chemical of concern. In this case, these chemicals are PFAS. What they announced is that by the end of 2019, a maximum contaminant level will be drafted. Maximum contaminant level is a limit that EPA sets, and in this case, that becomes enforceable. So water utilities will be responsible for ensuring that the concentration in the water for the selected compounds is below the maximum contaminant level, and they can be fined if the concentration is above that limit. This is a long process. It doesn't consist only on setting up the maximum contaminant level. There is a regulatory determination. So it's going to take a few more years. But as of now, EPA announced that by the end of the year, there will be an MCL. Also, it was determined that PFAS will be included in the next UCMR. As I mentioned earlier, UCMR 3 was completed in 2015. We are currently undergoing the UCMR 4. So at the earliest, PFAS will be included in UCMR 5. The list of specific compounds that are going to be included in this monitoring hasn't been published yet. At the same time that there is the regulatory discussion, researchers at EPA and other organizations, including the Department of Defense, ASTM International, as well as multiple researchers in universities and other research centers, are working on standardizing methods for other types of samples, environmental samples, as well as the analysis of total PFAS and non-target analysis. This is important because the method that has been published so far by EPA, 537 and 537.1, I'll talk about it in a few slides also, these two methods are applicable only for drinking water samples. So we have the regulatory discussions at federal level. We have different agencies working on producing and publishing methods that are standard for the community to use them and apply them. But in the meantime, the individual states are establishing their own limits in drinking water. Just a quick reminder, EPA has a health advisory at 70 nanograms per liter combined for PFOA, PFOS, but some individual states are moving forward and are establishing limits in the 10 to 15 nanograms per liter level. The map shown in the slide is a little outdated. It was published in 2018, and there are more states that have released new methods. So if you are interested in these specific limits, either contact me or look for the agency in charge in your state of monitoring the drinking water and the environment. Because of these requests from the states and in order to answer questions from citizens, laboratories, either commercial laboratories, water utilities, and other public agencies are really working on providing results based on the standard methods that have been published. As I said, for drinking water, these are EPA 537 and more recently 537.1, or they have developed in-house analytical workflows to answer the specific questions they receive. And these in-house methods are very useful to provide responses to different stakeholders, but they might be very different between different labs. So these methods are not really helpful when we are trying to compare or assess the occurrence of PFAS in different geographical areas, or to compare the efficiency of different water treatment processes, because, as I said, the methods might be different. Moving now to talk about methods. In the next slides, I'm going to focus on the standard methods that have been published by different agencies. The table shown in the slide summarizes these methods. We have, from top to bottom, method, the sample type that the methods are applied for, brief description of the sample preparation step, quantitation, and finally at the very bottom, we have listed the number of targets included in each method. If we go from left to right in the slide, we have method 537 and 537.1 published by EPA. 537 was published in 2009, 537.1 it was published in November of last year. And these methods are applicable for drinking water samples only. ASTM has two methods up to date. One is the D7979 that is applicable for different types of water, including groundwater, surface water, wastewater, and effluent. And ASTM D7968, it's applicable for solid samples, soil, sediments, sludge. The rest of the methods that are listed in the slide correspond to methods that are going to be published in the next month, and EPA is working on those. They also cover different types of water, source water, wastewater, the solid samples. And these methods are expanding the list of target analytes. There are two major approaches for the sample preparation. Some of the methods require the extraction, sample concentration by solid phase extraction with different absorbents, and other methods allow for the direct injection or dilute and shoot approach. The quantitation can be done, depending on the method, by using an external calibration, internal calibration, as well as isotopic dilution. And as I mentioned earlier, the number of targets changes from method to method. and talk a little bit more in detail about some of the methods listed here in the next slides. EPA method 537, 537.1. As I said earlier, 537 was published in 2009, and 537.1 was published in November of 2018. The core of the target compound is the same, but 537.1 was published to incorporate some of the replacement PFAS. On the table, I have highlighted the 4 compounds that were added to the list of targets in 537.1. GenX is the name that most commonly used for referring to these emerging replacement PFAS, but also you can come across the full name and the acronym HFPOBA. The sample preparation for these methods is very similar. The information was presented by Dr. Schumacher from the EPA in November of 2018 when multiple scientists from the agency provided a webinar with updates of the different methods. Either they are published or they are going to be published soon by EPA for the monitoring of PFAS. For the drinking water methods, 200 ml of samples need to be pre-concentrated through solid phase extraction. And this is one of the parameters that cannot be modified for this method. Once the sample is pre-concentrated, the extract is dried to completely, then it's reconstituted, and the reconstituted extract is injected in the LC-MS. Some people consider that this approach is not good for some of the more volatile PFAS, but this is the recommended workflow in method 537 and 537.1. In the newer version, the surrogate for GenX is highlighted in the screen, and that was the new addition to the surrogate compounds that are used in this methodology. ASTM methods follow a different approach. In this case, for the method D7979 that is suitable for water liquid samples, only 5 ml of samples are required. Surrogate is added, 5 ml of methanol are added, not really for extracting the sample, but for making sure that the different compounds, the different PFAS, behave well in the analysis. The sample with methanol is filtered, is acidified, and finally analyzed in the CMSM. And on the left side of the screen, you have the complete list of target analytes included in this method. The method that the ASTM published for solid matrices is very similar. In this case, you weigh the soil or the solid that you are working with, you add the surrogate, add basic methanol for extraction, remove the solids, acidify the extract, and finally analyze in the LC-MS. And the target compounds, also summarized in the screen, are the same for the liquid samples. So Shimadzu offers a portfolio of instruments that can help you in analyzing PFAS. We have 2 instruments, the triple quad LC-MS 8045 and LC-MS 8050, that are recommended for the methods that require solid phase extraction. These instruments are less sensitive because the analyst is going to be spending the time pre-concentrating the sample. We suggest customers to utilize these because you're going to be able to reach the detection limit required by the method because the sample is already pre-concentrated. For the people interested in using methods that allow for direct injection, we recommend the instruments that have higher sensitivity. So in this case, even though the investment upfront is a little higher because these instruments are the more sensitive instruments are slightly more expensive than the less sensitive ones, the return on investment is really good because you are minimizing the effort that you have to spend, not only preparing the sample, but also shipping the large volume of water from the sampling site to the laboratory where the analyses are going to be performed. Moving now to some applications, the results that I'm showing in the screen were provided to us by one of our customers, American Water Central Laboratory, belongs to the largest publicly traded water company in the United States. They participated in the UCMR 3 campaign, monitoring PFAS for the utilities and their service, but also some external customers. Based on the company's interest, they decided that they wanted to continue monitoring PFAS after the UCMR 3 campaign was concluded. So they've been collecting and analyzing samples in 16 states since UCMR 3 finished. This lab has some relatively high throughput for not being a purely commercial lab, and they analyze over 100 samples per month, according to EPA Method 537 with the triple quote LCMS 8050, as well as a different backup instrument. The detection limits that they are able to achieve with this instrument are highlighted within the red box. So for all the compounds included in the 537 method, this, again, a list larger than the original compounds monitored during UCMR 3. The detection limits that they are reporting are below the 2 nanograms per liter. Something very interesting about the system that American Water uses is that they were interested in switching back and forth between methods for drinking water. So the instrument is installed with a switching valve, so they can change, if needed, from analyzing PFAS by method 537 to analyzing cyanotoxin by the methods that EPA has for this purpose. The chromatogram shown in the screen was also provided by American Water, and it shows the resolution of the target compounds in the lowest standard of their calibration curve. So in less than 8.5 minutes, they are able to report the target compounds in method 537, and they've been using this, as I said, for analyzing a large number of samples across the country. Regarding EPA method 537.1, we've been working on it internally. Our application scientists have been working on the validation of this method utilizing the LCMS 8045. This is the least sensitive instrument in our portfolio. We decided to use it because if we can achieve the performance required by EPA with this instrument, we are sure that we'll be able to do it with the higher-end instrumentation also. For those who are not familiar with the analysis of GenX, this compound requires very different source conditions when compared to PFOA, PFOS, or the initial compounds in 537. So the work that was done internally demonstrated that despite changing the source conditions for being able to quantify GenX at the levels they desire, despite those changes, we achieve similar performance for the other compounds. So on the slide, I have now the detection limits reported for the compounds in 537. They are all in the 1 to 3 nanograms per liter. And in the next slide, I'll compare side by side the detection limits achieved during the validation of 537.1. Actually, the detection limits were slightly better with the validation in method 537.1, but this is also caused because we increased the injection volume. We moved from using 1 microliter injection to 5 microliter injection. But as you can see on the slide, the detection limits that we've achieved now are below 2 nanograms per liter for all the targets included in the 537.1. We have an application note that will be published soon, and also we are internally working on transferring these methods to our LCMS 9030, the QTOF, and one of the neat features of this instrument is like the source is the same as in the other LCMS methods. So you can easily transfer your methods from one platform, the LC QTOF, to the LC triple quad. Changing topics slightly. Still, we are talking about PFAS, but now it's a different approach. Our colleague Helmer Korp, his co-workers, developed the first of its kind mobile LCMS laboratory. So with this setup, they are able to provide almost real-time analysis, and they achieve this by combining the LCMS 8050 with the multipurpose sampling system from Herstel. They did this work when they were at Cascade Technical Services, but now they moved to PACE and they are employing this system in that new lab. Having these mobile labs has multiple advantages. The first one is instead of moving the samples from the contaminated site to the lab, you can just move the lab to the place where the analysis is needed and the results are needed. In this way, you minimize the sample collection effort and cost as well as transport. And this is also very important in the analysis of PFAS because this way you minimize the risk of contamination of the samples. When Hjalmar Korp and his colleagues developed this method, they combined EPA method 537 with the conditions required by D7979 and D7968 by ASTM, as well as some of the work that Shimadzu did in Japan using automatic online solid extraction. So the method was developed for soil and water matrices. The method is compliant with the quality requirements by the Department of Defense, and just injecting 50 microliters of sample for both cases, the soils method and the water method, and in less than 12 minutes and a half for the analytical run, they are able to generate the results regarding the PFAS of interest in the remediation site. I'm going to wrap up now the presentation going through some of the key ideas that I would like you to think about once we conclude the webinar. One of them is that the research community has been working on PFAS for a long time, for over 10 years. However, now is when the general public and the small laboratories, small entities, need our help to solve the challenges related to the analysis of PFAS. And this is happening in the US, and it's happening in other countries around the world. So the knowledge that was acquired during these past years by the scientific community needs to be transferred to the stakeholders in a way that is easy for them to apply it, in a way that is easy for small labs to generate answers to the questions they have. Standard methods are essential for evaluating the occurrence of PFAS, for evaluating how they are removed across multiple locations. It's very difficult for the small water utilities or small laboratories to answer questions to people in different states, in different regions, that they don't have the science background and they don't understand the difficulties of analyzing PFAS or why different people focus on different target compounds. There is a tremendous amount of work going on everywhere to develop and validate the standard method. And at Shimadzu, we have some instrumentation that can help you solving some of the challenges that you might have for the analysis of PFAS. With this, I conclude my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Marfil-Vega, for that informative presentation. It is now time to go to the question and answer period with the audience. Before we start, though, I just want to remind everyone in the audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which you can find on the right-hand side of the presentation window. All right, so let's get started here. So here's a first question. Are there any LC adaptations required according to the EPA or ASTM methods? For example, delay column, bypassing degasser, etc.
Thanks, Laura. That's a very interesting question. Yeah, there are, even if they are not necessarily required by EPA or ASTM, there are good laboratory practices that the people should implement to minimize the background contamination by PFAS. As I mentioned during my presentation, PFAS are everywhere. So it's very easy to find background levels from some of these chemicals. So in addition to modifying the LCMS, as the person who asked the question suggested, modifying you're installing a delay column or even bypassing the degasser. Another approach that the lab should look into is minimizing PFAS presence from the sampling supplies, even the clothing that is used by the sampling crews. Focusing again on the LC part. As I said, installing a delay column is really helpful. What it does is it delays the retention time at which the compounds, the PFAS, appear, so the user can separate the compounds that are coming from the sample from the compounds that are coming from the LC. This delay column is placed before the sample port, before the injection. So the PFAS that are coming from solvents, any tubing, Teflon tubing that might be remaining in the instrument, those compounds are going to be delayed and are going to show up in the chromatogram at a later time. Also, if possible, the degasser should be bypassed, as well as replacing tubing and other parts in the instrument that could contain PFAS, and by replacing them, we don't modify the performance of the instrument.
Excellent, thank you. Here's another one. What compounds are in the EPA short chain method?
Well, the final list is not completed, but short chain refers to perfluorinated or PFAS that have a carbon chain with less than 8 compounds. So something like PFBA, PFBS, PFHXS, PFHXA, those are short chain chemicals, as well as GenX. It's part of this, is considered part of these short chain chemicals. So as I said, the method is not published yet, and the final definitive list is not there, but those are the compounds, the ones with less than 8 carbons, as well as the new ether containing compounds like GenX are part of those short chain targets.
So you just mentioned GenX. Can the described EPA method 537.1 be used for the analysis of GenX in wastewater?
537.1 is only applicable for drinking water. So for the moment, there is no standard method to monitor GenX in wastewater. However, the methods that the EPA is working on together with other agencies, and the methods that are going to be published later this year are going to be suitable for analyzing wastewater and other types of matrices. But 537.1 is only for drinking water.
Are there any efforts to develop methods that are used to measure concentrations of PFAS in animals that are exposed to contaminated water sources?
At this time, I'm not aware of any method, but if anybody in the audience has any information about that, I think it'll be very useful if they can send us any information related to that. I know there are agencies that are starting to look into concentrations of PFAS in animal tissue, but I'm not aware of standard methods or methods that can be standardized and validated to be applied by the community.
Okay. So how do you prevent PFAS contamination during sample collection and preparation?
As I briefly touched a few minutes ago, we can, when you are going to be, the crews that are in the field, they need to make sure that the clothing that they use doesn't contain Gore-Tex, for example, or other, anti-repellent coatings. That's very important because traces of contaminants of PFAS can get into the sample collection by using those types of clothing. Also, it's very important, and it's one of the first safety measures when you are doing work-related lab, using the ETM, while you are collecting samples. Also, if you are going to be using automatic samplers, you need to make sure that the background is clean before you start collecting your samples, and whenever possible, replace any Teflon or any other materials that may contain PFAS. Make sure all the supplies that you use, the sampling bottles, any other item that you are going to be using during the sample collection or sample preparation are PFAS free. So, for example, if you are going to, you need to run solid phase extraction to prepare your sample, and you open a new lot number, you should always check that there is no PFAS background, or you cannot detect the target compounds you are looking for in those materials. And something very important is, like lately in the past years, we start seeing more and more consumer products that are labeled PFAS free. And most likely those are not going to have PFOA, PFOAs, but they might have other PFAS. So again, it's very important that you check, you run field blanks, laboratory blanks, to make sure that there is no background contamination for anything that may show up in your chromatogram that might be one of your compounds of interest.
Okay, here's another one. I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but I'll read it out, and I think you will. Are short chain PFAS or the less ionizing amides in PFAS recommended for LCMS?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, what it actually says is short chain PFAS or the less ionizing amides in PFAS shall be recommended for LCMS. I don't know if you're talking about what content, which part you can detect. Mm-hmm.
The short chain PFAS that I was mentioning earlier, like the alkyl substances, the carboxylic and sulfonic acids and GenX, those are still analyzed by LCMS. The amides, it's going to depend. It's going to depend of the compounds specifically. There are some precursors PFAS that are analyzed by GCMS also. So, but for the ones that are for higher interest right now for the water community, or the ones that EPA is focusing on, those are analyzed by LCMS.
Okay, great. There was another question. I think you've answered it though, because it was about what it means is how do you decide whether to use LCMS or GCMS when you're analyzing PFAS? Can you maybe just
It's going to depend.
That?
It's going to depend on the physical chemical properties of the compound. There are so many different compounds, and I said some precursors are analyzed by GCMS. So you are going to have to look at the properties of the compound and decide what's the best technique.
How does the inclusion of GenX affect the current analysis of PFAS, for example, with respect to EPA 537.1?
When GenX is analyzed together with the other compounds, the initial list of targets that was included in 537, the source conditions need to be dramatically changed. GenX is a nature compound. The properties are slightly different from the other PFAS that were in the method. So, as I said, the source conditions need to be changed. However, we at Shimadzu we have the data to demonstrate that we can analyze all the compounds together, and we'll be publishing an application note in the next week with the results and the conditions. They said the conditions are going to change. However, you can still obtain the performance that you need for the other compounds that were already in method 537.
Are there methods for analysis of seawater or fish? I suppose that means PFAS
Again,
in seawater or fish.
Similar to the other question, I'm not aware right now of standard methods in being prepared or being published already for seawater or fish. Seawater, you could do it. However, you are going to be the matrix is going to have a big impact in the instrument. Seawater has a lot of salts. Even if you pre-concentrate the samples, you are going to have problems when you concentrate during the solid phase extraction. So it could be done. However, you are going to have a lot of you have to anticipate a lot of challenges dealing with the sample prep and the maintenance of the instrument. Is the same as analyzing other contaminants in seawater. I was talking to a colleague a few days ago at the ACS meeting. He's analyzing sucralose in seawater. So you need to be ready to deal with the matrix.
Excellent. Well, I think with that we should wrap up. Thank you very much, Dr. Marfil-Vega, for your excellent presentation and for answering all those audience questions.
Thank you, Laura, for the opportunity to present about this interesting topic.
Thank you. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for attending and participating in today's event. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Shimadzu, for making today's webcast possible. In a few moments, a brief survey will appear on your screen, and we hope that you will participate. You will also receive an email from LCGC alerting you when this webcast is available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who might have missed today's live event. We hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.